A Navy SEAL broke protocol to save a hostage. Then his canine risked everything to save them both. They thought they could terrorize a widow and her daughter into submission. They thought no one would stand against corporate power and corrupted authority. They were wrong, because they didn't know that watching from a cabin on the ridge was a Navy SEAL haunted by the squad he couldn't save. And beside him stood a German shepherd who'd walked through fire for him before and would do it again. Before we begin, tell us where you are watching from. And if you want to support the channel, please subscribe and hit the like button on this video. Coldwater Ridge, Montana, crouched in the shadow of the Bitterroot Range, like a town that knew its days were numbered. October had bled into November, and the first snow had arrived 3 days early, dusting the peaks in white that would deepen into impassable drifts by Christmas. The wind came down from those mountains with a bite that spoke of the long winter ahead, carrying the smell of pine and the memory of smoke from the fire season that had ravaged the valleys 6 weeks prior. It was the kind of place people came to disappear, where 2,300 souls lived spread across valleys and ridges connected by a single 2-lane highway that twisted through the mountains for 40 miles before reaching anything resembling civilization. The town itself consisted of one main street, a dozen businesses struggling to stay open, and a post office that doubled as the social hub where rumors spread faster than the wildfires that threatened every summer. The mountains that surrounded Coldwater Ridge were beautiful in the way that dangerous things often are, promising solitude and peace, while hiding cliffs, crevasses, and weather systems that could kill the unprepared in hours. Lieutenant Marcus Thornton, though he was trying hard not to think of himself by that rank anymore, had chosen the cabin on the south face specifically because it was 4 miles from the nearest neighbor and offered clear sightlines in 3 directions. At 34 years old, he stood 6'2", with the kind of lean, coited muscle that came from years of carrying heavy loads over impossible terrain. His dark hair was cut close to his skull, gray creeping in at the temples despite his age, and a 3-inch scar bisected his left jaw where shrapnel had come within millimeters of severing his carotid in Kabul 8 months ago. That had been the mission that ended his career and killed everyone else on his team. Survivor's guilt, the Navy psychologist had called it, as if giving it a name made it something he could pack away in a box. She'd recommended this mandatory leave, 30 days to decompress before his final discharge review. 30 days to figure out if he wanted to stay in or muster out for good. Marcus had chosen Montana because it was far from oceans and deserts, far from anything that reminded him of the places where he'd left pieces of himself behind. He moved through the cabin with an economy of motion that 12 years as a Navy SEAL had made instinctive, each gesture purposeful, nothing wasted. His slate-gray eyes carried the perpetual watchfulness of someone who'd learned that relaxation could mean death, scanning, cataloging, assessing threats that existed only in memory. The cabin was small, just 2 rooms and a bathroom, furnished with the bare minimum. No photographs, no personal items, nothing that suggested permanence. He'd been here 11 days and still hadn't fully unpacked his duffel bag. Temporary. Everything was temporary now. Beside him, never more than a few feet away, Axe tracked his every movement with amber eyes that missed nothing. The German shepherd was 6 years old, 95 pounds of black and tan fur over dense muscle, with a distinctive white blaze across his chest that had earned him his full name, Axel von Schwarzwald. But everyone called him Axe, which fit better anyway. He wasn't a pet. Marcus had never made the mistake of thinking of him that way. Axe was a weapon, a tool of war, a military working dog trained in explosive detection and protection work who'd saved Marcus's life in 3 different countries. The dog's left rear leg was prosthetic, a sophisticated metal and polymer replacement for the limb he'd lost to an IED in Syria. It barely slowed him down. If anything, Axe had become more focused after the injury, as if he understood that he'd been given a second chance and refused to waste it. They'd served together for 4 years across 3 deployments, had developed the kind of wordless communication that came from trusting someone with your life on a daily basis. Marcus could read Axe's posture, the angle of his ears, the tension in his shoulders, and know what the dog sensed before any human would notice. In return, Axe responded to commands in German, single words that meant the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. Fass, bleib. Befuß, attack, stay, heal. The bond between them went deeper than training, deeper than the handler-dog relationship the military tried to maintain. When Marcus had been medically retired, he'd fought through 6 months of bureaucracy to adopt Axe rather than see him reassigned, or worse, euthanized for being too aggressive for civilian life. They were a package deal now, 2 damaged veterans trying to figure out what peace looked like. The routine they'd established over the past 11 days was simple and deliberately monotonous. Wake at 0530, 5-mile run regardless of weather. Breakfast, maintenance work on the cabin that didn't really need it. Lunch, another patrol of the property line. Dinner, then the long evening hours when sleep wouldn't come, and Marcus would sit on the porch watching the mountains fade into darkness while Axe dozed at his feet. It was supposed to be therapeutic. This isolation, this disconnection from the constant operational tempo that had defined his adult life. Instead, it felt like waiting, though for what, Marcus couldn't say. The town of Coldwater Ridge itself required a 15-minute drive down a gravel road that turned to mud when it rained and ice when it froze. Marcus had ventured down exactly 3 times in 11 days, twice for supplies, and once because the cabin's propane tank needed refilling. He'd spoken to perhaps a dozen people. Brief exchanges in the general store, where his military bearing and the way Axe stuck to his side like a shadow made folks give him a wide berth. That suited him fine. He hadn't come here to make friends. He'd come here to figure out if he could ever feel normal again, if the hypervigilance would ever fade, if he'd ever sleep through the night without jerking awake with his hand reaching for a weapon that wasn't there. But even in isolation, even trying to disconnect, Marcus noticed things. It was impossible not to, after so many years of noticing things keeping him alive. He noticed that the general store owner, a weathered man in his 60s named Frank, had tension around his eyes that had nothing to do with age. He noticed that conversations stopped when he entered rooms, that several buildings on Main Street sat empty with for sale signs that looked months old, that the few people he passed on the street moved with the hunched shoulders of folks carrying weight they couldn't put down. He noticed, and he deliberately chose not to dig deeper, because it wasn't his town, wasn't his problem, and he'd spent 12 years solving other people's problems at considerable cost to himself. On the morning of his 12th day in Coldwater Ridge, Marcus woke to Axe's low growl, a sound that brought him from sleep to full alertness in less than a second. The dog stood rigid at the window, ears forward, body tense. Marcus was beside him in 3 strides, hand instinctively going to his hip where his sidearm would have been on deployment. Empty. He'd locked his Sig Sauer P226 in the gun safe, trying to break the habit of being armed every moment. Through the window he saw nothing but the gray pre-dawn light filtering through the pines and the fresh snow that had fallen overnight, covering the world in white silence. Axe's growl deepened. Marcus dropped a hand to the dog's head, feeling the vibration through his palm. The dog's attention was fixed on the tree line 200 meters out. On something Marcus's merely human senses couldn't detect. After a long moment, Axe relaxed fractionally, though his eyes never left that spot. False alarm, maybe. A deer or elk moving through the forest. Or maybe not. Marcus made a mental note to check for tracks after sunrise, then tried to convince himself it mattered, that he cared about wildlife movement patterns on property he'd be leaving in 18 days. He couldn't get back to sleep. Instead, he made coffee as dawn broke cold and clear, standing on the porch in thermal layers while Axe methodically worked the perimeter, nose down, following scent trails only he could interpret. The mountains were beautiful in the morning light, peaks glowing gold while the valleys remained in shadow, the kind of vista that belonged on postcards. Marcus had seen beautiful places on 4 continents, and he'd learned that beauty meant nothing when measured against cruelty, corruption, or simple human meanness. Beautiful places could hide ugly truths just as easily as anywhere else. He had no way of knowing, standing there with his coffee growing cold in his hands, that 4 miles away, a 9-year-old girl named Sophia was waking up to find her inhaler missing and her mother bleeding from a split lip. He had no way of knowing that the fragile peace he'd been trying to construct was about to shatter. He had no way of knowing that by nightfall he'd make a choice that would drag him back into the world he'd been trying so hard to leave behind. But Axe knew. The dog sat at attention, staring down the mountain toward the town, ears swiveling to catch sounds too distant for human hearing. Something was wrong in Coldwater Ridge, something that would demand a response. And despite Marcus's desperate desire to remain uninvolved, to stay isolated, to protect himself from more failure and loss, that response was coming whether he wanted it or not. Some men could walk away from injustice. Marcus Thornton, it turned out, wasn't one of them. Elena Vasquez had learned resilience from the worst teacher imaginable: grief. 2 years ago, she'd buried her husband, Diego, after a wildfire in the Southern Valley had trapped him and 3 other firefighters in a canyon with no way out. She'd been an ER nurse for 10 years before that, had seen death in more forms than most people could imagine, but nothing prepared you for identifying your husband's body, for explaining to your 9-year-old daughter why Daddy wasn't coming home, for the way a house that had been full of laughter turned into a mausoleum of memories. The 40 acres of property on Coldwater Ridge's south face had been in Diego's family for 4 generations, a legacy passed from father to son, and now to widow and daughter. Elena had considered selling in those first dark months, but Sophia had begged her not to. This was where she remembered her father, where his presence lingered in the trees he'd planted, the deck he'd built, the fire pit where he'd told stories under the stars. So Elena had stayed, had learned to split wood and fix the water pump and do 100 things Diego had always handled. She'd discovered a core of steel in herself she hadn't known existed, a determination that surprised even her. At 38 years old, Elena stood 5'4" with dark curly hair that she kept pulled back in a practical ponytail, and worn brown eyes that held both softness and steel. She'd quit nursing after Diego's death, unable to return to the ER where trauma and loss were daily occurrences when her own trauma felt unmanageable. Instead, she'd started doing medical billing from home, work that paid less but allowed her to homeschool Sophia, who'd been bullied mercilessly at Coldwater Ridge Elementary after her father's death. Kids could be cruel, and Sophia had been an easy target, quiet and sad and struggling with asthma that sent her to the nurse's office 3 times a week. At home, Sophia thrived. She was bright, curious, spent hours reading or drawing or helping her mother tend the small garden they maintained. Mother and daughter had built a new life from the wreckage of the old one, smaller and quieter, but theirs. Then Caldwell Energy Solutions had come to town, and everything changed. It started subtly, a representative in an expensive suit appearing at her door with an offer to purchase the property, professional and courteous, explaining that CES was consolidating land holdings for a mining operation, that her 40 acres sat in a crucial location, that they were prepared to offer fair market value plus 20%. Elena had declined. The land wasn't for sale. The representative had smiled, thanked her for her time, said the offer would remain open if she reconsidered. She'd thought that was the end of it. She'd been catastrophically wrong. Over the following months, 8 other families who'd refused to sell had their lives systematically dismantled. Frank Morrison, who owned the general store, found his commercial insurance inexplicably canceled. The Hendersons, who ran a small ranch, had their water rights challenged in court by shell companies with lawyers that cost more per hour than most Coldwater Ridge residents made in a week. The Pratts lost their house to a fire the volunteer department arrived too late to stop, the investigation ruling it accidental despite evidence of accelerants. One by one, families sold and left. Elena watched it happen, watched her community hollowed out, and still refused. This was Sophia's inheritance, Diego's legacy. She wouldn't surrender it to corporate predators, no matter how much pressure they applied. The pressure, as it turned out, had barely begun. 3 weeks ago, a different man had appeared at her door. Travis Kern, head of security for CES, 6'3" and 240. 30 pounds of muscle and scar tissue, with dead eyes that looked at her like she was an obstacle to be removed rather than a person. He'd been less polite than the first representative. Mrs. Vasquez needed to be reasonable. Mrs. Vasquez needed to think about her daughter's safety. Accidents happened in these mountains, especially to people living alone in isolated cabins. Elena had ordered him off her property. He'd smiled, a expression that never reached his eyes, and said he'd be back. He'd kept that promise. His crew, 6 men who looked like they'd learned their trade in prisons or war zones had started making regular visits, banging on her door at 2 in the morning, slashing her tires, killing her chickens and leaving the bodies arranged on her porch. Sheriff Hutchins, when she'd called, had been sympathetic, but useless, suggesting maybe she should reconsider the sale, that CES was bringing jobs and prosperity to Coldwater Ridge, that standing in the way of progress was foolish. This morning had been the worst yet. Elena had woken to Sophia's panicked cry and found her daughter in respiratory distress, lips tinged blue, reaching for the inhaler that should have been on her nightstand. The inhaler that was gone. Elena had torn the house apart searching, while Sophia's breathing grew more labored, finally finding it in the trash outside, stepped on, destroyed. She'd driven like a demon down the mountain to Doc Mercer's clinic in town, Sophia wheezing in the passenger seat, terror clawing at her throat. Doc Mercer had administered a nebulizer treatment and given Sophia a new inhaler, had looked at Elena with sympathy and something else. Fear, maybe, or guilt. He hadn't asked how the inhaler had been destroyed. He hadn't had to. Everyone in Coldwater Ridge knew what was happening. No one was willing to help. On the drive back, Elena had stopped at Frank's General Store for groceries, Sophia waiting in the truck with strict instructions not to leave. Elena was comparing prices on rice when she heard the bell over the door jangle and looked up to see 3 of Kern's crew entering. She recognized them immediately. The tall one with the shaved head and neck tattoos. The shorter, stockier one with scarred knuckles. The youngest one, maybe 25, with a smirk that made her skin crawl. They saw her, and their trajectory changed, moving toward her aisle with predatory focus. Frank was helping another customer, too far away to intervene even if he'd been willing. Elena straightened, forcing steel into her spine, refusing to show the fear that made her hands tremble. The tall one stopped 2 feet away, invading her space deliberately. "You're still here," he said. His voice was rough, damaged by cigarettes or screaming, or both. "That's disappointing, Mrs. Vasquez." "Mr. Caldwell is losing patience." "I'm not selling," Elena said. Her voice came out steady, which felt like a victory. "The property isn't for sale. It will never be for sale." The stocky one laughed, a sound like gravel scraping concrete. "Everything's for sale, lady. You just haven't figured out your price yet." The young one leaned against the shelf behind her, boxing her in. "Heard your daughter had some breathing trouble this morning. That's rough. Asthma's dangerous. Especially out here so far from help. Be a real shame if something happened and you couldn't get her to a doctor in time." The threat was naked, undisguised. Elena's vision narrowed, rage and terror warring in her chest. "You stay away from my daughter. You stay away from my property. I swear if you touch her." "You'll what?" The tall one stepped closer, looming over her. "Call the sheriff? He knows we're here, sweetheart. He doesn't care. Nobody cares. You're alone. The sooner you accept that, the easier this gets." That was when the bell over the door jangled again. Elena couldn't see who entered from her position, but she saw the reaction in the 3 men surrounding her. The tall one's eyes cut toward the entrance and something flickered there. Not quite fear, but a cousin to it. Wariness. The stocky one took a half step back. Even the young one straightened, the smirk fading slightly. A man moved into Elena's peripheral vision. Tall. Broad-shouldered, moving with an economy of motion that suggested military training. He didn't look at Elena or her harassers, just moved to the counter where Frank stood frozen, and set down a package of batteries. But beside him, attached to his left side by an invisible tether, was a German shepherd that looked less like a pet and more like a weapon with fur. The dog was massive, 95 pounds of muscle, with a distinctive white blaze across its chest and amber eyes that tracked the room with unnerving intelligence. And its left rear leg, Elena noticed with a jolt, was prosthetic, gleaming metal and polymer where flesh and bone should have been. The dog's gaze fixed on the 3 men surrounding Elena. Its ears came forward. A low rumble emerged from its chest, barely audible but unmistakable. The tall man's hand dropped to the dog's head, a brief contact, and the growl ceased. But the dog didn't look away. "We should go," the stocky one muttered. The tall one nodded, stepping back from Elena with deliberate slowness, refusing to make it look like retreat. The young one lingered a moment longer, then followed. As they passed the newcomer, The tall one paused. "Nice dog," he said. The words carried an edge, half threat, half question. The man with the dog looked at him for the first time. Elena saw his face in profile, mid-30s, scarred jaw. Gray eyes that held the kind of stillness dangerous men possessed. He didn't respond verbally, just held the gaze until the tall one looked away first and continued toward the door. The three men left, the bell jangling their departure. The tension drained from the store like water from a broken dam. Frank exhaled audibly. The man with the dog turned back to the counter, paid for his batteries in cash, and started toward the exit. Elena didn't plan to speak. Didn't plan to draw attention, but her voice emerged anyway, raw and grateful. "Thank you." The man paused, glanced back. His expression was unreadable. "I didn't do anything. You didn't have to." Elena managed a trembling smile. Sometimes being there is enough. He studied her for a long moment, and Elena had the unsettling sensation of being assessed, catalogued, evaluated, through a lens she couldn't understand. Then he nodded once and left, the dog at his side, silent as a shadow. Elena gathered her groceries with shaking hands and returned to her truck where Sophia waited, pale and anxious. She drove home, trying to convince herself that the encounter meant nothing, that the stranger's presence had been coincidence, that she was still alone in her fight against forces too powerful to resist. But that night, lying awake in bed, while Sophia slept down the hall, Elena thought about the dog's growl, the way the men had backed down without a word being spoken, the stranger's gray eyes that had seen too much, and for the first time in months, she felt something. Hing that might have been hope. Marcus told himself for the third time in as many hours that what happened in Frank's general store wasn't his concern. He'd intervened without intending to. His presence and Axe's reaction enough to diffuse a situation that had clearly been escalating toward violence. But that was where his involvement ended. The woman, whoever she was, had her own problems, and Marcus had spent 12 years solving other people's problems in other people's countries. He was done. He'd come to Montana to find peace, not to wade into local conflicts he didn't understand. Axe disagreed. The dog had been restless since they'd returned to the cabin, pacing the perimeter, pausing frequently to stare down the mountain toward town. At 1900 hours, as full darkness settled over the ridge, Axe positioned himself at the door and whined, a sound he rarely made. Marcus tried to ignore it, tried to focus on the book he wasn't reading, but the dog's agitation was infectious. Finally, at 21:30, Axe barked once, sharp and insistent, then began growling continuously, a low rumble that vibrated through the floorboards. Marcus set down his book and moved to the window. The night was moonless, clouds obscuring the stars, the kind of darkness that city dwellers never experienced. He saw nothing unusual. Just the black mass of trees against the marginally lighter sky, but Axe's senses exceeded his by orders of magnitude. The dog was detecting something, and 4 years of trusting that detection in combat zones had kept Marcus alive. He made a decision he knew he'd regret. Unlocking the gun safe, he retrieved his Sig Sauer and 3 magazines, along with the tactical flashlight and night vision monocular he told himself he wouldn't need on this trip. Axe's agitation increased as Marcus geared up, the dog recognizing the preparations, understanding they meant action. Marcus pulled on his jacket, clipped Axe's lead, and stepped into the cold November night. The temperature had dropped to 28 degrees, his breath clouding in the still air. Marcus paused on the porch, letting his eyes adjust, listening. After 30 seconds, he heard it. Distant, carried on the wind from downslope. Raised voices, a crash, and underneath it all, a sound that made his blood freeze. A child, screaming. Not his fight, not his town, not his problem. The words repeated in his mind like a mantra, as his feet carried him down the slope toward the sounds. Axe pulled against the lead, wanting to run, but Marcus maintained control, moving quickly but quietly through the forest, using terrain and shadows the way he'd been trained. The voices grew louder. He could distinguish individual words now. Profanity and threats, delivered in male voices, slurred with alcohol or rage or both. The child had stopped screaming, which was somehow worse than the sound had been. 400 meters from his cabin, Marcus emerged from the tree line and found himself looking at a small house, lights blazing from every window, 2 pickup trucks parked haphazardly in the driveway. Through the front window, he could see movement, figures struggling. One of the trucks had a magnetic sign on the door, Caldwell Energy Solutions, the letters visible in the light spilling from the house. The same company name he'd noticed on the business cards scattered around town, on the new construction site near the highway. On the checks, the bartender at the Coldwater Tavern had complained about because they took 2 weeks to clear. Marcus unclipped Axe's lead and gave the hand signal for tactical approach. The dog moved into the shadows, circling toward the house's blind side, while Marcus approached from the front, his night vision monocular revealing details invisible to the naked eye. 5 men inside, 1 woman, 1 child. The woman was the same one from the general store, he realized with a jolt. Dark curly hair, smaller frame, backing toward a hallway while trying to shield someone behind her. The child, presumably. 3 of the men from the store were there, along with 2 others Marcus didn't recognize. One was holding a tire iron. Another had a hunting knife on his belt. This wasn't intimidation anymore. This was attempted murder. Or would be, if he didn't intervene. The smart play was to retreat, call the authorities, let the system handle it. Marcus had his phone in his pocket, could have 911 dialed in seconds. But he'd seen the sheriff's department cruiser, parked outside the Caldwell Energy office yesterday afternoon. Had registered the way locals talked about law enforcement with resignation rather than trust. And even if he called, response time to this isolated location would be 15 minutes minimum. Too long. Far too long. Marcus moved to the front door and tested the knob. Locked. Inside, he could hear the woman's voice, steady despite the obvious terror. "You need to leave, right now. I've called the sheriff. He's on his way." A lie, Marcus suspected, but a good one. The response was laughter, cruel and confident. "No, you didn't, lady. And even if you did, Dale ain't coming to save you. He knows what this is. Everyone knows. You brought this on yourself." Marcus stepped back and kicked the door just below the lock. The frame splintered, the door slamming inward with a crack like a gunshot. The scene inside froze, all 5 men turning toward the intrusion, shock registering on faces that had been twisted with malicious intent seconds before. Marcus stood in the doorway, Sig Sauer held low-ready position, his voice flat and cold when he spoke. "Leave. Last chance. Final warning. You don't get another." The tall one from the store, the apparent leader, recovered first. His hand moved toward his waistband, toward what was almost certainly a weapon concealed there. He never completed the motion. Axe exploded through the kitchen doorway behind the group. 95 pounds of trained aggression, moving faster than the human eye could track. The dog hit the tall man from behind, jaws clamping onto his right forearm with precisely calibrated force, enough to disable without inflicting permanent damage. The man screamed, went down hard, his weapon clattering across the floor. The stocky one lunged toward Marcus with the tire iron. Bad decision. Marcus sidestepped, caught the man's wrist. Used his momentum to drive him face first into the wall. The impact was wet and crunching, and the stocky man slid down to sit dazed and bleeding from a broken nose. The young one from the store pulled his knife. Dumber decision. Marcus closed the distance before the blade could come up, delivered a palm strike to the solar plexus that collapsed the man's diaphragm, followed by a knee to the face as he doubled over gasping. The knife clattered from nerveless fingers. The remaining 2 decided discretion was the better part of survival. They bolted for the back door, crashing through it into the night. Marcus let them go. A tall one was writhing on the floor, trying to free his arm from Axe's jaws, making sounds between screams and whimpers. Marcus gave a single command in German. Aus. Release. Axe let go immediately, backing away but maintaining focus on the downed man, ready to re-engage at any signal. Marcus moved through the house methodically, clearing rooms the way he'd cleared 1,000 buildings in a dozen countries, his weapon tracking his sightline. Kitchen, empty. Bathroom, empty. 2 bedrooms, both clear. He returned to the living room where the woman stood frozen, arms wrapped around a small girl who pressed against her mother's side. The child was perhaps 9 years old, thin and pale, with her mother's dark hair and eyes too wide in a face too small. "Are you hurt?" Marcus asked. His voice was still flat, professional, the tone he'd used in combat zones. The woman shook her head, then seemed to realize her daughter needed reassurance and found her voice. "We're okay. Sophia, baby, we're okay." The child didn't respond, just clutched her mother tighter. Marcus holstered his weapon and pulled out his phone, photographing the 3 men on the floor, the broken door, the destruction visible throughout the room. Evidence, though for what authority, he wasn't sure. The tall one had managed to sit up, cradling his injured arm, his face pale with shock and pain. Marcus crouched in front of him. "Who sent you?" The man's eyes were glazed, but retained enough awareness to show fear. "You don't know who you're messing with. Mr. Caldwell, Mr. Caldwell isn't here. I am." Marcus's voice dropped lower, colder. "Answer the question. Who gave you the order to come here tonight?" "Kern, Travis Kern," he said to convince her. "Make it clear she doesn't have a choice." The tall man coughed, tasted blood, spat. "We weren't gonna kill her, just scare her, make her understand." By threatening her child? Marcus felt rage building beneath his controlled exterior, forced it down. "You broke into her home. You brought weapons. You terrorized a woman and a little girl. Call it whatever helps you sleep, but we both know what this was." He stood, pulled out plastic zip ties from his jacket pocket, military-grade restraints he'd carried out of habit. Within 2 minutes, all 3 conscious men were secured, wrists bound behind their backs. The woman, Elena, watched with expressions cycling between shock, gratitude, and disbelief. Finally, she found words. "Who are you?" The question was simple, but loaded with subtext. "What are you? Why are you here? Why did you help?" Marcus met her eyes. "Just passing through. Wrong place, wrong time. For them." He gestured at the bound men. "You need to call someone. Federal authorities, not local police. Whoever Caldwell and Kern are, they've got local law enforcement compromised." "I know." Elena's voice cracked. "I've known for months. I tried the FBI office in Helena 6 weeks ago. They took a report. Said they'd investigate. I haven't heard anything since. Then you call them again tonight. You have witnesses now, evidence. This crossed from intimidation to home invasion, assault, attempted kidnapping. Federal offenses. They'll have to respond." Marcus moved toward the door, axe falling into position beside him. The dog limped slightly on his prosthetic leg, the high-speed action having stressed the connection point, but his eyes remained alert, scanning for threats. "Wait." Elena's voice stopped him at the threshold. "You can't just leave. They'll come back, if not tonight, tomorrow, the next day. This won't stop them, it'll make them angrier." Marcus knew she was right, knew that by intervening he'd escalated a situation he didn't fully understand, had painted a target on his own back alongside hers. The smart move was to extract now, return to his cabin, pack his gear, and disappear before dawn. He could be 3 states away before anyone connected him to this incident. But he looked at the woman standing in her destroyed living room, at the child clutching her mother, at the fear and desperate hope warring in Elena's eyes, and he saw a dozen other civilians he'd protected in a dozen other places. Saw his squad, the men he'd lost because he'd made wrong call at the wrong moment. Saw a chance, maybe, for something that looked like redemption. "Pack bags for you and your daughter. Essentials only. You're coming with me tonight. My cabin, 4 miles up the ridge, defensible position, clear sightlines." Marcus heard himself making the offer and couldn't quite believe it. "Tomorrow we figure out how to end this. But tonight, you need to be somewhere they can't find you." Elena didn't argue, didn't waste time with questions. She simply nodded and disappeared into the bedroom. Emerging 3 minutes later with a backpack and a small duffel, Sophia clinging to her hand. Marcus made one more call on his cell, not to local authorities, but to a number he'd sworn he wouldn't use except in emergencies. It rang 4 times before a familiar voice answered. "This is Thornton. I need a federal law enforcement contact in Montana who isn't compromised, and I need them tonight. It's going to get worse before it gets better." The hike back to Marcus's cabin took 40 minutes. Elena and Sophia struggling with the terrain in darkness, while Marcus led them through paths only he and Axe knew. The dog ranged ahead, his prosthetic leg handling the uneven ground with mechanical efficiency, pausing frequently to ensure the route remained clear. Sophia never complained, though her breathing grew labored halfway up, and Elena had to stop twice to administer her inhaler. Marcus adjusted his pace, his tactical mind already cataloging the vulnerabilities this presented. The child's asthma was a liability in a crisis, limiting mobility, requiring medication that could run out. But judging from the fierce protectiveness in Elena's eyes every time she looked at her daughter, suggesting they separate wasn't an option worth considering. The cabin appeared through the trees, dark and silent. Marcus had left no lights burning, a habit from too many years operating in hostile territory. He cleared the interior quickly while Elena and Sophia waited on the porch with axe, the dog positioning himself between them and the forest, vigilant. Satisfied the cabin was secure, Marcus ushered them inside and locked the door, checking that the windows were latched before turning on a single lamp in the corner, keeping the illumination low. Elena stood in the center of the small living space, taking in the Spartan furnishings, the lack of personal items, the gun safe visible against one wall. Her expression was unreadable, cycling through exhaustion, shock, and determination. Sophia had migrated to the couch, curling into a ball with her arms wrapped around her knees, her eyes tracking Axe as the dog completed his own inspection of the space before settling near the door. Marcus moved to the kitchen area and started coffee, the familiar ritual giving his hands something to do while his mind processed the situation he'd inserted himself into. Elena followed, keeping her voice low so Sophia wouldn't hear. "I don't even know your name." The statement held equal parts gratitude and accusation. Marcus Thornton. Horton, Lieutenant, Navy SEALs, retired. He didn't elaborate, didn't explain the medical retirement or the mandatory leave, or the fact that his discharge papers weren't finalized. The military rank was enough to establish credibility. Elena absorbed this, nodded as if it explained everything she'd witnessed. "I'm Elena Vasquez. That's my daughter Sophia. She's 9. Her husband died 2 years ago in the wildfire," Marcus remembered from overheard conversations in town, piecing together context. "This is about your property, the land Caldwell Energy wants. 40 acres, that's been in my husband's family for 4 generations." Elena's voice hardened. "There's lithium under these mountains. Caldwell discovered deposits 18 months ago. Has been systematically buying up land ever since. 90% of Coldwater Ridge is already his, through shell companies and front organizations. But he needs total ownership to get the EPA permits for mining operations. My property sits right in the middle of the richest vein. As long as I refuse to sell, his entire project is stalled. So he's escalating from intimidation to violence." Marcus poured 2 cups of coffee, pushed one toward Elena. "How long has this been happening?" 3 months of serious pressure. Before that, it was just offers and legal maneuvering. But I'm the last holdout. 8 other families refused initially, but they all sold eventually or left after mysterious accidents. Elena's hands wrapped around the mug, seeking warmth. The Pratts lost their house to arson. The Johnsons' teenage son was beaten so badly he spent 2 weeks in the hospital. Frank Morrison at the general store, his wife developed stage 4 cancer, and the treatment costs bankrupted them. Convenient timing. And the local authorities? Marcus already knew the answer, but needed confirmation. Sheriff Hutchins is on Caldwell's payroll. So are both judges in the county court. State police won't get involved without a formal complaint from local law enforcement, and that's never happening. I tried the FBI 6 weeks ago, but nothing came of it. Elena's voice cracked slightly. "I'm a widow with a sick child fighting a multimillionaire with unlimited resources and no conscience. I knew how this was going to end. I just didn't want to believe it. It's not ending the way Caldwell thinks." Marcus made the statement with certainty he didn't entirely feel. But Elena needed to hear confidence, needed to believe resistance was possible. "The call I made tonight was to a friend at JSOC, Joint Special Operations Command. He's connecting me with FBI agents in the Public Corruption Unit, people who specialize in exactly this kind of systemic abuse. They'll be here within 48 hours. Elena looked at him with an expression that contained too much hope, the dangerous kind that could shatter into despair. "Why are you doing this? You don't know me. You don't owe me anything. This isn't your fight." Marcus had been asking himself the same question since he'd kicked down her door. The honest answer was complicated, tangled up with survivor's guilt and a need for purpose, and the simple fact that he'd never been able to walk away from injustice. even when walking away was the smart choice. But he gave her the simpler truth. Because I can. Because someone has to. Because men like Caldwell only win when everyone else decides the cost of fighting is too high. Meanwhile, 4 miles away and 300 feet lower in elevation, Travis Kern received a phone call that turned his evening from routine enforcement to crisis management. He was in his office at the Caldwell Energy Solutions compound, a converted warehouse on the outskirts of Coldwater Ridge that served as headquarters for the security operations. The compound housed his crew, their vehicles, weapons, and the surveillance equipment that monitored properties throughout the region. Kern had been reviewing the next day's intimidation schedule, deciding which of the remaining businesses to target, when his phone lit up with a call from the tall one, whose name was Derek Moss. Kern listened to Moss's stuttering explanation for 30 seconds before interrupting. "Say that again." Slowly. "A man broke into the Vasquez house?" His voice was calm, but his free hand clenched into a fist hard enough that his knuckles went white. "He didn't break in. We were already inside. He came in after. Military, boss. Special forces or something. Had a dog. One of those German shepherds like the police use, except this one was different, like it'd been in combat. Took down 3 of us in under 10 seconds. Moss was talking fast, fear making his words run together. Tied us up with military restraints. The guy knew what he was doing, moved like he'd done this 1,000 times. Said we were going to federal prison for home invasion and assault. Where are you now?" Kern forced his voice to remain level. "County hospital. Doc set my arm. Says the dog bite needs antibiotics. Sheriff Hutchins interviewed us, took a report, but he's not doing anything. Says we need to lay low for a few days." Moss paused. "Boss, this guy isn't like the others. He's not scared. And that dog, it was like a weapon, responding to commands I couldn't even hear. We need to back off the Vasquez woman, at least until." "We're not backing off anything." Kern cut him off. "You 3 couldn't handle 1 man and a dog? 6 of you went to that house. What happened to Richards and Cooper?" "They ran when the shooting started." "Well, not shooting exactly, but you know what I mean. The violence. It was fast, boss. Professional. Like he'd done this in war zones." Kern ended the call and sat staring at his computer screen for a long moment, his mind working through scenarios and responses. This was a complication, but complications could be managed. Caldwell paid him extremely well to ensure that problems disappeared, and that's exactly what this military veteran would become. A disappeared problem. But it required escalation, required bringing in resources he'd been holding in reserve. He dialed a different number, this one reaching the man who signed his paychecks. Richard Caldwell answered on the second ring, his voice carrying the crisp efficiency of someone accustomed to taking calls at all hours. "This is Kern. We have a situation with the Vasquez property." Caldwell listened without interrupting as Kern explained the evening's events, the mischievous veteran's intervention, the assault on his crew. When he finished, silence stretched for 5 seconds before Caldwell responded. "Who is he?" "This veteran?" His voice remained calm, but Kern detected the edge underneath, the barely controlled anger of a man unaccustomed to setbacks. "Unknown at this time. I'll have identification within 2 hours. Military bearing, close quarters combat training, works with a military working dog. Likely special operations background, possibly SEAL or Delta." Kern pulled up surveillance footage from town cameras as he spoke, scrubbing through until he found the figure from the general store incident. There. Tall, broad-shouldered, moving. With economy of motion. The German shepherd with the white chest blaze and prosthetic rear leg was distinctive. "I'll run facial recognition, check military databases. I don't care what his credentials are." Caldwell's voice went cold. "I care that he's interfering with my project. The Vasquez woman has cost me 6 months and $17 million in delayed operations. I will not allow some transient veteran with delusions of heroism to extend that timeline. Handle this." "Travis, permanently, if necessary." "Understood." Kern allowed himself a thin smile. "If it comes to permanent solutions, that'll require additional resources. My crew is good for intimidation, but military-trained opposition requires military-trained response. Then acquire those resources. Cost is irrelevant. I want this resolved within 72 hours. The Vasquez property will be mine, and whoever this veteran is, he'll learn that there are consequences for inserting himself into matters that don't concern him. Caldwell paused. And Travis, make it clear to anyone else in Coldwater Ridge considering resistance. Public examples discourage future problems. The call ended. Kern opened his encrypted contacts list and scrolled to a name he'd hoped not to use. Garrett Stone, former Marine Recon, dishonorable discharge for excessive force in Fallujah, currently running a private military contractor outfit that specialized in operations too dirty for legitimate companies. Stone's crew consisted of 8 men, all combat veterans, all with flexible ethics and expertise in making problems disappear. They were expensive, but Caldwell had just authorized unlimited budget. Kern placed the call. Stone answered with a voice like gravel scraping concrete. Talk. I need a team in Montana by dawn. Full combat loadout. Target is military, special operations background, considered extremely dangerous. Kern pulled up the surveillance image on his screen. I'm sending you everything I have. This is a termination contract. Full deniability. Payment on completion. Rate is $50,000 per operator, plus expenses. Stone's tone suggested this was non-negotiable. 72-hour minimum contract, whether we finish in 1 day or 3. And if this target is what you say he is, someone with SEAL or Delta training, it goes to double rate. Those men don't die easy. Agreed. Kern authorized the expense without hesitation. Caldwell wanted this resolved, and Stone's crew could deliver. How fast can you mobilize? We're in Idaho Falls. Training contract just finished. Call it 6 hours to your location. Stone paused. One more thing. Is this goes loud. If law enforcement gets involved, we were never there. You never hired us. Our contract was security consultation for an energy company, nothing more. Understood. This stays quiet. The target is isolated, 4 miles from town. We contain it there. No witnesses, no evidence. Kern felt anticipation building. This would send the message Caldwell wanted. Demonstrate the futility of resistance. After the call ended, Kern spent 20 minutes establishing surveillance on the mountain roads leading to the ridge where his sources indicated the veteran had property. He activated the drone equipped with thermal imaging, launched it toward the coordinates, and within 15 minutes had visual confirmation. A cabin, isolated, with 3 heat signatures inside, 2 adult-sized, 1 child-sized, and 1 dog. By dawn, those signatures would be cold, permanently. Back at the cabin, Elena had settled Sophia into Marcus's bed, the only bedroom in the small structure, while she planned to take the couch. Marcus would maintain watch through the night, a routine so familiar it required no thought. Axe had already positioned himself by the door, head up, ears rotating to catch sounds beyond human hearing. The dog would alert to any approach long before danger arrived. Elena emerged from the bedroom, closing the door softly. She's asleep. First time in weeks she's felt safe enough. She looked at Marcus with eyes that held gratitude and something else. Fear, maybe, or the beginning of understanding about what the next days would bring. This won't end peacefully, will it? Marcus checked his weapon, press-checking the chamber, confirming the magazine was seated. No, Caldwell has too much invested to back down now, and we just humiliated his security team, proved they're not invincible. He'll escalate. Probably bring in professionals, former military contractors who know what they're doing. And you think you can stop them? The question wasn't accusatory, just realistic assessment. I think I'm going to try. Marcus met her gaze. And I think federal intervention arrives before this turns into a war. But I need you to be ready for the possibility that it doesn't. If shooting starts, you take Sophia into the basement. There's a crawl space under the foundation that leads to an exit 200 meters into the woods. Axe will guide you. You run and you don't stop until you reach the highway. Elena nodded slowly, processing the instructions, the implications. Thank you for everything. For being willing to stand when no one else would. Marcus didn't respond, just returned his attention to the window, to the darkness beyond, to the coming storm he could feel building like pressure before thunder. Somewhere out there, Caldwell and his people were planning their response. And Marcus, despite every intention to remain uninvolved, to stay isolated, to protect himself from more loss, had just declared himself an obstacle that needed removing. The war was coming. whether he was ready for it or not. Dawn came cold and gray, the sky heavy with clouds that promised snow before nightfall. Marcus had maintained watch through the night, rotating between observation points that gave him overlapping fields of fire covering all approaches to the cabin. Axe had alerted twice, both times to deer moving through the forest. The dog's ability to distinguish threat from wildlife refined through years of combat deployment. By 0600, Marcus knew two things with certainty. First, Caldwell's response was coming. The only question was timing. Second, he was running out of time to establish a defensive advantage before superior numbers made his position untenable. Elena emerged from the bedroom at 0630, moving quietly to avoid waking Sophia. She found Marcus in the kitchen, studying topographic maps of the surrounding terrain spread across the small table. Coffee was already brewing, the smell filling the cabin with an illusion of normalcy that both of them knew was false. "How bad is it going to be?" Elena's voice was steady, but Marcus noticed the way her hands trembled slightly as she poured coffee. "Caldwell has resources and motivation. We humiliated his people, proved they're vulnerable. He can't let that stand, not if he wants to maintain control over this town." Marcus traced a finger along one of the ridgelines on the map. "He'll bring in professionals, probably former military contractors. My guess is 6 to 8 operators, experienced. Well armed, they'll come at dawn or dusk, use low light to their advantage. What are our chances?" The question was direct, unflinching. Marcus met her eyes. "If this was just about me and Axe against whenever they send, I like our odds. We have defensive position, knowledge of terrain, an element of surprise because they'll underestimate us. But you and Sophia change the equation. I can't maneuver freely if I'm protecting fixed positions, and any prolonged engagement risks civilian casualties. So what do we do?" Elena's voice hardened with determination. "I won't run. I won't give Caldwell that satisfaction. This is my land, my home, Diego's legacy. If we're making a stand, we make it here." Marcus studied her for a long moment, recognizing the steel beneath the fear, the same quality he'd seen in resistance fighters and local allies across a dozen countries. People who'd been pushed past the point where survival mattered less than dignity, where fighting back became inevitable, regardless of odds. He nodded slowly. "Then we fortify. Turn this cabin into a position they can't take without casualties they're not willing to accept. And we make sure that when federal authorities arrive, there's evidence of everything Caldwell has done." He pulled out his phone, began photographing the maps, creating a record. "I need you to write down everything. Names, dates, incidents. Every family that was forced out, every suspicious accident, every threat. Documentation matters." They spent 2 hours preparing. Marcus walked Elena through the cabin's defensive features, showed her the reinforced door frames he'd installed without consciously planning for combat, the firing positions that covered all approaches, the escape routes through the crawlspace. He distributed his spare magazines, taught her basic operation of his backup Glock 19, and drilled her on what to do if shooting started. Sophia woke halfway through and watched with wide, frightened eyes as her mother learned to check a weapons chamber and proper sight alignment. The girl didn't ask questions, seemed to understand that adult conversation wouldn't provide comfort. At 0915, Marcus's phone buzzed with a text from his JSOC contact, "Federal agents en route. ETA 1400 hours. Hold position. Assistance available if situation deteriorates." The message provided both relief and increased tension. 5 hours. He needed to keep Elena and Sophia safe for 5 hours, prevent Caldwell's forces from overwhelming their position before help arrived. Doable, if the opposition came in predictable patterns. Catastrophic, if they had air support or heavy weapons. At 0940, Axe's behavior changed. The dog stood rigid at the window, facing downslope, ears forward, body tense. A low growl emerged, the sound Marcus had learned to interpret as immediate threat. He moved to the window, raised his binoculars, and scanned the tree line 600 meters out. Nothing visible initially, then movement, a glint of metal, a figure in tactical gear moving between trees with practiced efficiency. Then another, and another. Marcus counted 5 separate positions, all advancing in coordinated pattern that spoke of military training. "They're here," he said quietly. "Elena, take Sophia to the basement, now. Don't argue, just move." Elena grabbed her daughter, who clutched her stuffed bear and inhaler, and disappeared down the stairs. Marcus heard the basement door lock, then silence. He turned his full attention to the approaching threat, his mind shifting into combat mode, adrenaline sharpening his senses. Axe remained at his side, waiting for commands, a weapon ready to deploy. The attack came in two phases. First, suppressive fire from 4 positions, automatic weapons sending rounds into the cabin's exterior walls, shattering windows, chewing through wood. Marcus dropped below the window line, counted the rhythm, identified weapons by their sound. 3 AR-15 variants, 1 AK platform, probably a 7.62. Professional equipment, controlled bursts rather than spray and pray. These weren't Kern's street thugs, these were soldiers. During a pause in the fire, Marcus rose to a crouch, acquired the nearest target through his rifle scope, and squeezed the trigger. The suppressed round took the operator in the upper chest, center mass, dropping him immediately. Marcus shifted, acquired a second target, fired again. This one went down clutching his leg, the femoral hit deliberate, incapacitating without killing. He wasn't trying to rack up body count. Just demonstrate that assaulting this position carried unacceptable cost. The incoming fire intensified, multiple weapons converging on his position. Marcus dropped again, moved to a secondary firing position on the opposite side of the cabin, and assessed. 2 operators down, at least 3 still effective, but they'd stopped advancing. Good. They were reassessing, recognizing that their intelligence had underestimated the opposition. In that moment of hesitation, Marcus gave Axe his command: SAS, Lynx, attack, left side. The dog exploded through a side window Marcus had pre-positioned for exactly this purpose, a blur of black and tan moving through the forest at speeds that made tracking difficult. Axe had done this in Afghanistan, in Syria, in Iraq. Hunting armed men was what he'd been trained for, what he'd been bred for. His prosthetic leg, far from slowing him, gave him traction on the snowy ground that his organic legs might have lost. Marcus heard shouting from the tree line, panicked voices, then screaming. Axe had found his target. Marcus provided covering fire, keeping the other operators pinned while his partner worked. 30 seconds later, Axe emerged from the trees, moving back toward the cabin at full speed. Marcus opened the door, let the dog inside, saw blood on his muzzle that wasn't his own. The dog was panting but uninjured, his amber eyes bright with adrenaline. Brav, guter Hund, good dog. Marcus permitted himself a brief moment of contact, hand on the dog's head, before returning to the window. The attack had stalled. 3 operators down or disabled, the others retreating to regroup. But Marcus knew this was just the opening engagement. They'd come again, with different tactics, more caution, probably trying to flank or use standoff weapons. His phone buzzed. Unknown number. He answered, gun still trained on the tree line. A voice he didn't recognize. Male. Calm, professional. You're making this harder than it needs to be. That was Travis Kern, Marcus realized. Caldwell's head of security. The property owner and her daughter walk away right now. This ends. No harm, no charges. Just leave Montana and never come back. Counteroffer. Marcus kept his voice flat. You and every one of Caldwell's people leave this mountain in the next 5 minutes, and maybe you avoid federal prison for attempted murder, assault, conspiracy, and about 15 other charges I can think of. FBI's en route. They'll be here in 4 hours. You've got that long to decide if dying for a mining operation is worth your paycheck. Silence stretched for 10 seconds. Then Kern's voice returned, colder. You don't know who you're up against. Caldwell owns this town, owns the county. Federal agents show up, they'll find nothing but a tragic accident. Veteran suffering PTSD has violent episode. Local security responds in self-defense. That's the story everyone will tell, because that's the story Caldwell pays them to tell. Except I've documented everything. Recorded your men's assault last night. Photographed evidence, sent it to multiple locations. Your operators are already on camera. This isn't going away, and neither am I. Marcus paused. 4 hours, Kern. Clocks ticking. Use them wisely. He ended the call. Immediately, his phone rang again. Different number. This time, a woman's voice. Rachel Koenig. A name triggered recognition. The journalist Elena had mentioned. Marcus answered. Marcus Thornton, I'm a reporter with the Helena Independent. I've been investigating Caldwell Energy for 8 months. Elena Vasquez contacted me an hour ago, said you're defending her property, that Caldwell's people are attempting to kill you. She paused. I'm 20 minutes out with a camera crew. Whatever happens up there, it's going public. Caldwell can't control the narrative if it's live-streamed. Marcus felt a piece of the tactical puzzle click into place. Witnesses. Public exposure. Caldwell's power relied on operating in shadows, controlling information flow. Sunlight was the best disinfectant, as the saying went. Get here fast, and stay off the main road. They'll have it watched. There's a fire access road on the East Ridge, coordinates as follows. He rattled off GPS data from memory. En route. And Mr. Thornton? Don't die before we get there. The story's better if you're alive to tell it. The line went dead. Outside, the forest had gone quiet, the kind of silence that preceded renewed violence. Marcus knew the pattern. The operators were regrouping, calling for instructions, probably arguing about whether the contract was worth dying for. Some would advocate withdrawal. Others, the true believers or the ones with more loyalty to paycheck than survival instinct, would push for escalation. Within minutes, he'd know which faction won. Axe growled. Different tone this time. Not threat detection, but alerting to something unexpected. Marcus scanned the tree line, saw nothing initially, then spotted it. Smoke, rising from multiple points downslope. They weren't just attacking the cabin. They were starting a fire, using the wind and dry conditions to create a wildfire that would force evacuation or incinerate everyone inside. It was brutal, indiscriminate, and exactly the kind of scorched earth tactic Marcus would have expected from people with unlimited resources and no conscience. He grabbed his radio, keyed the emergency frequency for fire services. This is Marcus Thornton. Coordinates as follows. Multiple structure fires spreading rapidly. High wind conditions. Request immediate aerial support. He didn't expect help, not with Caldwell controlling local services, but creating the radio record mattered for later prosecution. The fires spread faster than seemed natural, multiple ignition points suggesting accelerants. Within 10 minutes, flames were visible through the trees, smoke thickening, the wind pushing upslope directly toward the cabin. Marcus ran the calculations. 20 minutes before the fire reached their position, maybe 30 if wind direction shifted. Not enough time for federal agents to arrive. Barely enough time to evacuate. He moved to the basement door, knocked twice. Elena, we're leaving. Fire's closing in. Positions no longer tenable. Grab Sophia and emergency supplies. We're moving to secondary location. Elena emerged with Sophia clinging to her, both wearing heavy coats, the girl's backpack stuffed with medications and water. Where do we go? The house is surrounded. They'll shoot us the moment we're in the open. Not if we move during the fire. Smoke provides concealment. Flames create chaos. They'll be pulling back from the heat, creating gaps in their perimeter. Marcus shouldered his pack, checked his weapon. Axe leads. I follow. You stay between us. Sophia, you hold your mother's hand and don't let go for any reason. We're moving fast through rough terrain. Can you do that? The 9-year-old nodded, her face pale but determined. I can do it. Then let's move. Marcus opened the door, felt the heat wash over them even at 200 meters distance, the smoke already thick enough to sting his eyes. The cabin he'd rented, the temporary sanctuary, would be ash within the hour. But Elena and Sophia would be alive, and that was the only mission objective that mattered. Axe plunged into the smoke, Marcus and his charges following, disappearing into the burning forest as gunfire echoed behind them. The smoke was both enemy and ally, choking their lungs while concealing their movement through terrain that would have been impassable under direct observation. Marcus led them on a route he'd scouted during his first days in the cabin, a game trail that wound through dense forest and rocky outcroppings, offering cover and multiple decision points where they could alter direction if pursued. Axe ranged ahead, his thermal signature invisible to the dog, but his senses detecting threats human eyes would miss. Sophia kept pace better than Marcus had expected, her small hand locked in her mother's grip, her breathing labored but controlled through sheer force of will. They covered 2 miles in 40 minutes, circling wide around the fire's advancing edge, moving perpendicular to the wind that pushed flames upslope. Marcus stopped them twice to listen, ensuring no pursuit, checking that Sophia's breathing remained manageable. The second stop, Elena administered the inhaler, her hands steady, despite the fear Marcus saw in her eyes. The girl took 4 puffs, held each breath, then nodded she was ready to continue. The destination was a hunting blind Marcus had discovered during his reconnaissance, a small structure built into a rock formation that provided shelter and concealment while offering sightlines down 2 converging valleys. It wasn't ideal, but it was defensible and unknown to Caldwell's forces. They reached it at 1100 hours, Marcus clearing the interior before allowing Elena and Sophia inside. The space was cramped, maybe 8 feet square, with gaps in the wooden walls that let in light and cold air. But it was dry and hidden, camouflaged against the rocks, invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. Marcus positioned Elena and Sophia in the back corner, gave them emergency rations and water, then took up position near the entrance with his rifle and a clear field of fire. Axe settled beside him, the dog's breathing elevated from exertion, but his attention unwavering. Marcus checked his phone. 1 bar of signal, barely enough. He composed a text to Rachel Koenig with their new coordinates, sent it, waited to confirm delivery. The message went through after 30 seconds. Response came 2 minutes. Newts later, 10 minutes out. Caldwell's people have roadblocks on main highway. We're coming in through back country. Camera is rolling. Whatever happens next, the world is watching. Marcus allowed himself a moment of grim satisfaction. Caldwell's power relied on controlling information, buying silence, making problems disappear. But you couldn't disappear what was broadcast in real time. Couldn't buy off thousands of viewers watching events unfold. The calculus had shifted. Now it wasn't just about survival, but about ensuring that survival was witnessed, documented, made undeniable. Movement in the valley below caught his attention. 3 figures in tactical gear, advancing in loose formation, sweeping the area. They were tracking, following the route Marcus's group had taken, reading signs in disturbed vegetation and displaced snow. Professional work, the kind of tracking that required training and experience. Marcus estimated 5 minutes before they reached the blind's location. He had options. Engage from concealment, use superior position to disable them before they could return fire. Or remain hidden, let them pass, avoid contact that would reveal his position. The tactically sound choice was avoidance. But these were the same men who'd tried to burn a woman and child alive, who'd terrorized an entire town, who represented a system of corruption that relied on good people choosing not to fight back. Marcus made his decision. He sighted through his scope, acquired the lead tracker, aimed low for a leg shot that would incapacitate without killing. His finger began taking up trigger slack. Then Axe's body went rigid, the dog's attention snapping to a different direction entirely. Not the 3 men below, but something else. Someone else. Marcus shifted his aim, scanned the new vector, and felt ice form in his gut. Sophia. The girl had somehow slipped past her mother, had moved to the blind's entrance, was standing in the opening with her stuffed bear clutched to her chest, staring down at the valley where the 3 armed men were visible. Elena was reaching for her daughter, horror on her face, but moving slowly to avoid sudden motion that would draw attention. Marcus's mind calculated angles and outcomes in microseconds. The trackers hadn't seen Sophia yet, their attention focused on ground sign, but in seconds one would look up and spot the girl silhouetted against rock. Their response would be immediate and lethal. He could shoot first, drop all 3, but muzzle flash would reveal their position and bring every operator in the area. Or he could grab Sophia, pull her back, hope the movement went unnoticed. No good options, only degrees of catastrophic. The decision was taken from him. One of the trackers raised his head, his gaze sweeping upward, locking onto the blind. His rifle began to rise. Marcus's finger completed its press, the suppressed round catching the man in the shoulder, spinning him sideways. The other 2 operators reacted instantly, dropping into cover, weapons coming up, scanning for the shooter. Marcus fired twice more, both rounds impacting near but not on target, forcing them to stay pinned. He grabbed Sophia, pulled her back inside, thrust her toward Elena. Stay down, don't move, don't make a sound. His voice was flat command, the tone that had sent men into combat zones and brought them back alive. He returned to his firing position, knowing the brief engagement had accomplished one thing. It had announced their location to every hostile within a mile radius. They were about to be swarmed. Axe was already moving before Marcus gave the command, the dog understanding that their position was compromised. That defense now required offense. Marcus gave him the hand signal for autonomous engagement, releasing the dog to operate independently, to use his training and instincts to disrupt enemy movement. Axe disappeared into the rocks, a ghost with fur and teeth, and absolutely no hesitation about attacking armed men. The radio on Marcus's vest crackled, a frequency he'd been monitoring but hadn't expected to hear. Federal Channel, FBI Tactical Unit, Fortin. This is Special Agent Valdez, FBI Public Corruption Unit. We are inbound to your location, ETA 10 minutes. Be advised, we have arrest warrants for Richard Caldwell, Travis Kern, and 6 others. Local law enforcement has been secured. I repeat, federal jurisdiction is now in effect. Hold your position. Marcus keyed his radio. Valdez, I am engaged with multiple hostiles, at least 6 operators, possibly more. Civilians in danger. Situation critical. I need air support or ground reinforcement immediately. He gave coordinates, described the tactical situation in clipped military terminology that conveyed both urgency and control. Support is en route. Medevac helicopter launching from Helena, armed escort. Montana State Police SWAT is 15 minutes behind us. Hold position. Protect civilians. We are coming to you. Valdez's voice carried the calm authority of someone who'd run operations in hostile territory, who understood that 10 minutes could be eternity in combat. Marcus had 10 minutes to keep Elena and Sophia alive, 10 minutes to prevent Caldwell's mercenaries from overwhelming their position, 10 minutes to ensure that justice, delayed or obstructed and nearly destroyed, finally had its chance. He checked his ammunition. 4 magazines remaining, 30 rounds each. 120 rounds against an unknown number of enemies with unknown capabilities. The math wasn't favorable, but mathematics had never been the deciding factor in combat. Will was. Skill was. The absolute refusal to let innocents die on your watch was. Gunfire erupted from 2 directions simultaneously, rounds impacting the rock formation, chipping stone, sending fragments spraying into the blind. Marcus returned fire, controlled bursts, forcing the shooters to keep their heads down. He couldn't see Axe but heard the dog's impact, a man's scream. Then the distinctive sound of someone falling hard. Axe was doing what he'd been trained to do, disrupting enemy formations, creating chaos that bought seconds and meters. Then the sound Marcus had been dreading, rotor blades. Caldwell had air support, a helicopter rising over the ridgeline, its side door open. A shooter visible with what looked like a light machine gun. The calculus had just shifted catastrophically. He couldn't defend against aerial assault. Not with the weapons Marcus had. The hunting blind's concealment meant nothing from above. They had perhaps 60 seconds before that machine gun turned their shelter into a kill zone. Marcus grabbed Elena and Sophia. We're moving. Right now. He pulled them out of the blind, into the rocks, moving with desperate speed toward a cliff face he'd noticed during approach. There, a narrow crevasse barely wide enough for a human body, offering overhead protection from aerial fire. He shoved Elena through first, then Sophia, finally squeezing in himself as the helicopter's gun opened up, rounds chewing through the hunting blind, destroying it utterly. Really, the crevasse provided protection but also trapped them, one entrance, no exit except back the way they'd come. Marcus assessed their situation with brutal honesty. They were pinned, outgunned, with minutes before ground forces closed in. Axe was somewhere in the rocks, still fighting, still buying time. Federal help was coming, but might arrive too late. This was the moment every operator dreaded, where training and equipment and courage weren't enough. Where the only remaining variable was luck. Then he heard it. Different rotor signature, heavier, military. Marcus risked a glance from the crevasse and saw the most beautiful sight of his life. A Montana Army National Guard Blackhawk, rising over the opposite ridge, door guns manned, clear federal markings. The helicopter wasn't just rescue. It was authority made manifest, overwhelming force that even Caldwell's mercenaries couldn't match. The pilot's voice came over the radio. This is Warhorse 6-1 to all armed personnel in the valley. You are ordered to lay down weapons and surrender immediately. Federal arrest warrants are in effect. Resistance will be met with lethal force. This is your only warning. For 5 seconds, the valley held its breath. Then, one by one, figures emerged from the trees and rocks. Hands raised, weapons dropped. The mercenaries were soldiers enough to recognize when a contract was over, when the cost of continuing exceeded any possible payout. Caldwell's helicopter banked hard and fled, the pilot making the same calculation, abandoning the ground force to save himself. Marcus emerged from the crevasse, weapons still ready, but no longer needed. Axe materialized from the rocks, limping slightly, blood on his muzzle and side, but moving under his own power. The dog came directly to Marcus, sat, waited for acknowledgement. Marcus dropped a hand to the dog's head, felt the tremor of exhaustion, the heat of blood that was probably not all Axe's own. Guter Hund, sehr guter Hund. Very good dog. The words were inadequate, insufficient to convey what the animal had done, what he'd risked, how he'd saved them all. But Axe didn't need elaborate praise. He needed only the touch, the tone, the knowledge that he'd done his job and his handler was safe. Elena emerged from the crevasse with Sophia, both unharmed but shaking with adrenaline crash. The girl looked at the dog with wide eyes, then reached out tentatively to touch his head. Axe, who tolerated affection from almost no one except Marcus, allowed it, his tail moving slightly. Sophia buried her face in his fur and began crying, all the fear and stress releasing at once. The Black Hawk landed in the valley, disgorging FBI agents in tactical gear who immediately began securing the scene, taking the mercenaries into custody, documenting evidence. Special Agent Valdez approached Marcus, a woman in her 40s with sharp eyes that assessed him in seconds. "Lieutenant Thornton, your reputation precedes you." She extended a hand. Marcus shook it, noting the firm grip, the calluses that suggested she'd done field work, not just administrative duty. "We've been building a case against Caldwell Energy for 11 months. Couldn't move until we had ironclad evidence and could secure local cooperation. Your actions tonight accelerated our timeline considerably." "Is Caldwell in custody?" Marcus asked. The question was tactical. The head of the snake mattered more than the body. "Not yet. He's at his residence in town, probably destroying evidence as we speak. But we had his communications, financial records, testimony from 3 of his employees who flipped when they realized federal charges were coming." She smiled grimly. "He's going to prison, Mr. Thornton, along with Sheriff Hutchins, Travis Kern, and about 15 others. This is over." Rachel Koenig arrived minutes later, her camera crew filming everything. Asking questions, Marcus deflected to Valdez. The story would be told, but by people whose job was storytelling. Not by a veteran who just wanted isolation and peace, and had instead found himself in another war. Elena gave a brief statement, her voice shaking but clear, describing months of terror, systematic intimidation, the destruction of her community. Sophia stayed close to Axe, her hand on his head, the dog accepting the role of emotional support animal despite his military training. By 1400 hours, the immediate crisis had passed. Caldwell had been arrested at his mansion, attempting to flee with $2 million in cash and falsified documents. His empire was crumbling, shell companies exposed, corrupted officials turning on each other. The fire Marcus's cabin had been contained by aerial tankers, though the structure itself was total loss. Didn't matter. It had never been home, just temporary shelter, and he'd found something more valuable in its defense: purpose. The thing he'd been searching for since Kabul, since losing his squad, since beginning mandatory leave that was supposed to help him decompress. Turned out decompression wasn't what he'd needed. Purpose was. The knowledge that his skills, his training, his willingness to stand between predators and prey still mattered, that he could still save people when it counted. As medevac treated Axe's injuries, superficial lacerations but nothing permanent. Marcus sat with Elena and Sophia on the helicopter that would evacuate them to safety. The girl had fallen asleep against her mother, exhausted, her inhaler clutched in one small hand. Elena looked at Marcus with eyes that held gratitude and something else. Understanding, maybe. "What happens now?" she asked quietly. "For you, I mean. Where do you go from here?" Marcus considered the question. His mandatory leave had 2 weeks remaining. His discharge review would determine if he stayed in the military or mustered out. The cabin was gone. He had no fixed address, no obligations, no ties. Freedom, he supposed, though it felt less like liberation than weightlessness, the kind that preceded falling. I don't know yet, the honest answer, but I'll figure it out. You could stay. Elena's voice was tentative but sincere. Coldwater Ridge will need rebuilding, people who can stand up to whoever tries to fill Caldwell's void. And Sophia, she looks at you and acts like you're heroes from one of her books. We could use heroes around here. Marcus looked at the sleeping child, at the dog resting at his feet, at the mountains outside the helicopter window. Staying meant commitment, meant planting roots, meant risking the kind of connections that could be severed by violence or loss. Everything he'd been running from. But maybe running was the problem. Maybe the answer wasn't isolation, but purpose. Not fighting for strangers in foreign countries, but protecting communities that deserved protection. Being the person who stood when others couldn't. I'll think about it, he said. It wasn't a promise, but it wasn't a refusal either. It was possibility, and for the first time in 8 months, possibility felt like enough. The aftermath of violence was always slower and more bureaucratic. And the violence itself. Marcus spent 3 days giving statements to federal investigators, walking them through the timeline of events, providing evidence documentation he'd meticulously compiled during the crisis. Special Agent Valdez ran the investigation with efficiency that Marcus appreciated, cutting through jurisdictional complications and ensuring that everyone involved in Caldwell's conspiracy faced appropriate charges. By the end of the second day, 18 people were in federal custody, including Richard Caldwell himself, Travis Kern, Sheriff Hutchins, and most of Caldwell's security team. The mercenaries who'd attacked the cabin had been identified as employees of a private military contractor operating without proper licensing, adding weapons charges and conspiracy to the list of federal offenses. The media descended on Coldwater Ridge like a second invasion. Rachel Koenig's footage had gone viral within hours, her live coverage of the helicopter assault and federal intervention watched by millions. Major networks picked up the story, framing it as David versus Goliath, corporate corruption versus individual courage, veteran with PTSD finding redemption through protecting the innocent. Marcus hated every second of the attention, declined all interview requests, and spent most of his time in the hospital where Axe was recovering from his injuries. The dog had sustained deep lacerations to his side and shoulder from fighting Caldwell's operators, required 40 stitches and prophylactic antibiotics, but the veterinarian pronounced him remarkably healthy for an animal who just engaged multiple armed men in single combat. Elena and Sophia were staying with Frank Morrison and his wife while their property was secured and assessed for habitability. The fires had come within 200 meters of Elena's house, but hadn't reached it, though smoke damage was extensive. Insurance adjusters and federal evidence teams were still processing the scene, documenting everything for the prosecution. Elena visited Marcus at the hospital daily, bringing coffee and updates, slowly transitioning from rescued victim to something approaching friend. Sophia came too, spending hours sitting beside Axe's kennel, reading to the dog from books about adventure and bravery, the kind where heroes always won and good always triumphed. Axe tolerated the attention with surprising patience, his usual wariness softened by the child's obvious adoration. On the 4th day, Marcus received the call he'd been expecting. His commanding officer at Naval Special Warfare Command, Captain Morrison, who'd been monitoring the situation through classified channels. The conversation was brief and professional. Lieutenant Fortin, you've created a significant media incident. The Navy is receiving questions about one of our SEALs engaging in domestic paramilitary operations. We need to discuss your status. Marcus had anticipated this, understood the institutional concern. A SEAL on medical leave wasn't supposed to be fighting private wars on American soil, regardless of justification. With respect, sir, I was defending civilians from an armed assault. Self-defense and defense of others are legal under Montana state law and federal statute. No paramilitary operation, just a veteran who happened to be in the wrong place at the right time. I've read the FBI reports. Morrison's voice softened slightly. I'm not questioning your actions, Marcus. What you did was exactly what we train our people to do. Protect those who can't protect themselves. But your discharge review is scheduled for next week, and this incident complicates the medical retirement assessment. Some people are arguing that if you're capable of sustained combat operations, you're capable of returning to active duty. Marcus felt something tighten in his chest. The idea of returning to his team, to the operational tempo, to missions in countries whose names he couldn't mention, should have brought relief or purpose. Instead, it brought only exhaustion. I'm not the same operator I was before Kabul, sir. I'm functional in crisis, but that doesn't mean I'm fit for the teams. The psych evaluations were clear about that. I know, and I agree with them, for what it's worth. Morrison paused. But I'm giving you an option. We can delay the discharge review, give you another 6 months to continue treatment and reassessment. Or we can proceed as scheduled, and you accept medical retirement with full benefits and honorable discharge. Your choice, but you need to make it now. Marcus looked at Axe, sleeping in the kennel beside him, the dog's breathing deep and even, his prosthetic leg visible through the wire mesh, looked at the mountains outside the window, at the town below that was beginning the slow process of healing. Thought about Elena's question in the helicopter. What happens now? Where do you go from here? Proceed with discharge, sir. I'm done. I've given 12 years, and I've got nothing left for the teams. But I'm not done serving. Just need to find a different way to do it. The words felt right, felt true in a way that surprised him. Understood. Morrison's tone carried respect. You've earned your rest, Marcus, and for what it's worth, what you did in Montana, protecting that family, standing against corruption, that's the kind of thing that makes me proud to have served with you. Take care of yourself, and take care of that dog. He's earned his rest too. The call ended. Marcus sat in silence, processing the finality of it. In 1 week, he'd officially separate from the Navy, ending a career that had defined his entire adult life. The structure, the purpose, the identity he'd built would be gone, leaving him to construct something new from pieces he wasn't sure fit together anymore. Terrifying and liberating in equal measure. Elena found him an hour later, still sitting beside Axe's kennel, staring at nothing. She didn't ask what he was thinking, just sat beside him, comfortable with silence in a way few people were. After several minutes, she spoke. The FBI says we can return to the house in 2 days. They finished processing evidence, and the insurance company approved emergency repairs. She paused. It's going to take months to make it truly livable again, but it's structurally sound. Sophia and I can move back, start rebuilding. That's good. Marcus meant it. Elena and Sophia deserve to reclaim their home, their lives, their sense of safety that Caldwell had tried to destroy. You'll have help. The community will rally once people understand they don't have to be afraid anymore. Already happening. Frank's organizing volunteers, people who were too scared to resist Caldwell but are ready to help now that he's gone. Elena smiled, but it faded quickly. There's something else. The other families Caldwell forced out, 8 of them, they're filing a class action lawsuit against his company. Federal prosecutors say the assets will be frozen and eventually liquidated to pay restitution. The families might actually get compensation, might be able to come back if they want. And to justice, slow and imperfect, but justice nonetheless. Marcus felt satisfaction at that, the knowledge that the system, when it finally engaged, could still function as intended. Caldwell and his people would spend years in federal prison. The families they'd victimized would receive compensation. Coldwater Ridge would rebuild. Not perfect closure, but better than most stories ended. Rachel Koenig stopped by that evening, not as a journalist, but as someone who'd become invested in the outcome. She brought copies of her published articles, the stories that were circulating nationally, framing the Coldwater Ridge incident as exemplar of both systemic corruption and individual courage. Marcus skimmed them, uncomfortable with the heroic framing, the way the narrative simplified complex events into clean triumph of good over evil. You made me the hero of this story, he said. That's not accurate. Elena's the hero. She's the one who refused to surrender for months before I showed up. She's the one who kept fighting when everyone told her it was hopeless. Rachel nodded. You're right, and I've written that story too. Elena's resistance, the other family's struggles. But Marcus, people need both stories. They need to see that ordinary people can resist, and they need to see that trained protectors will stand with them when they do. You represent something important. The idea that skill and training should be used to protect the vulnerable, not exploit them. That matters. Marcus didn't have a response to that, wasn't sure he agreed, but recognized the truth in it. People needed stories that confirmed their belief in justice, in protection, in the possibility that strength could be used for good. If his actions provided that, even in simplified narrative form, maybe that had value beyond the immediate tactical situation. On the 6th day, Axe was cleared for release from the veterinary hospital. The dog emerged from his kennel moving stiffly, favoring his injured side, but alert and responsive. Marcus paid the bill, which was substantial, but covered by emergency funding the FBI had arranged, and walked Axe out into cool November air that smelled of snow and pine. The dog paused on the sidewalk, lifted his head, scented the wind, then looked back at Marcus with amber eyes that held something approaching contentment. They walked through Coldwater Ridge, Marcus noting the changes even in less than a week. New faces, people returning now that Caldwell's shadow had lifted, storefronts being cleaned and repaired. A sense of renewal, tentative but real. Frank waved from the general store, called out thanks that Marcus acknowledged with a nod. Others did the same. People who'd been too afraid to speak now offering gratitude, recognition, respect. It should have felt good. Mostly it felt heavy, the weight of expectation, the unspoken assumption that he'd stay, that he'd become permanent fixture in their recovery. Elena's house stood at the end of a gravel road, surrounded by forest, the structure showing smoke damage but intact. She was on the porch when Marcus arrived, supervising volunteers who were replacing damaged siding. Sophia spotted Axe immediately, ran to greet the dog with delighted cry, then stopped herself, remembering the injuries, approaching more carefully. The girl knelt beside Axe, wrapped her arms gently around his neck, and whispered something Marcus couldn't hear. The dog's tail moved slowly, acceptance. Elena descended from the porch, wiping sawdust from her hands. "Welcome back, both of you." She looked at Marcus with an expression he couldn't quite read. "I heard about your discharge. Congratulations or condolences, I'm not sure which applies. Both, probably." Marcus watched Sophia and Axe, the easy companionship between child and war dog that shouldn't have been possible, but was. "I'm officially civilian in 4 days. No structure, no orders, no mission parameters. First time since I was 18. That's terrifying and exciting." Elena understood. He could see it in her eyes. "So what's next? Where does Marcus Thornton go when he's not Lieutenant Thornton anymore?" Marcus had been asking himself the same question for 6 days, running scenarios, evaluating options, trying to separate what he wanted from what he thought he should want. The honest answer was complicated. "I don't know yet. Part of me wants to disappear, find some remote cabin even more isolated than the last one, spend time figuring out who I am without the uniform. But another part thinks that's running away, avoiding instead of healing. What does the second part want?" Elena's voice was gentle but direct. Marcus met her eyes. Purpose, not the kind the military provided, but something similar. "Using what I know to help people who need it." He gestured at the town below, at the mountains beyond. Places like this exist all over the country. Isolated communities where corruption can take root because there's no oversight. No one willing to stand up. Maybe that's what I'm supposed to do. Find those places, be the person who stands. That sounds lonely and dangerous. Elena paused. But it also sounds like you, like the person who kicked down my door when you could have walked away, who protected Sophia when it would have been easier to protect yourself. She smiled. "For what it's worth, if you want a place to start, to test whether that's really what you want. Coldwater Ridge could use someone like you, at least for a while, until we're stable enough to stand on our own." Marcus considered the offer, the implied invitation to stay, to plant temporary roots, to see if purpose could be found in reconstruction as well as protection. It wasn't the isolation he'd sought when he'd come to Montana, but isolation had proven to be the wrong answer to the wrong question. Maybe what he needed wasn't absence of connection, but different kind of connection, one built on shared values and mutual protection rather than military hierarchy. "I'll think about it," he said. The same words from the helicopter, still not commitment, but closer to possibility. "For now, I'm staying until the discharge paperwork finalizes. After that, we'll see." "Fair enough." Elena's smile widened. "But while you're here, you might as well make yourself useful." She pointed at the damaged porch. Those boards aren't going to replace themselves. Marcus found himself smiling back, the expression strange on his face, unused. He couldn't remember the last time he'd smiled and meant it. All right, but I'm warning you, my carpentry skills are minimal. Then you'll fit right in. Most of us are learning as we go. Elena handed him a hammer, the tool heavy and familiar in his hand, despite never having framed a house. Welcome to civilian life, Marcus. It's messy and complicated and nothing like the military. But it's real, and that counts for something. Marcus took the hammer, climbed the porch stairs, and began working alongside volunteers who'd found courage to rebuild what had been torn down. Axe settled in the yard, watchful, Sophia reading beside him. The mountains rose beyond, beautiful and indifferent. And for the first time since Kabul, since losing his squad, since beginning the long journey toward whatever came next, Marcus felt something that might eventually become peace. Not yet, but maybe soon. And maybe that was enough. 3 months had passed since the fire on the ridge, since federal agents had descended on Coldwater Ridge and dismantled Richard Caldwell's empire brick by brick. Winter had settled over Montana with the kind of cold that made breathing painful and turned the mountains into impassable barriers of snow and ice. Marcus had stayed, initially telling himself it was temporary, just until Elena's house was fully repaired, just until the community stabilized, just until he figured out what came next. But temporary had a way of becoming permanent when you stopped counting days and started living them. The discharge had been finalized in late November, his separation from the Navy complete with full medical retirement benefits and an honorable discharge that came with commendations he hadn't expected. Captain Morrison had written a letter for his file, praising his actions in Montana, noting that true service continued beyond uniform. Marcus kept the letter in a drawer, unread after the first time, uncomfortable with praise for doing what had simply needed doing. He was Marcus Thornton now, not Lieutenant Thornton, veteran but no longer active military. The transition had been easier than anticipated, perhaps because he'd replaced one sense of purpose with another. He'd rented a small house on the edge of town, 2 bedrooms and a yard where Axe could patrol without bothering neighbors. The dog had healed completely, his injuries leaving scars under his fur, but no permanent damage beyond what the prosthetic leg already represented. Axe had adjusted to civilian life better than Marcus, spending his days accompanying Marcus on walks through town, accepting attention from locals who'd come to view the German Shepherd as hero equal to his handler. Sophia visited 3 times a week, reading to Axe, bringing treats Elena baked, slowly transforming from traumatized child into something approaching normal 9-year-old. She still had nightmares occasionally, still kept her inhaler within arm's reach at all times, but the fear that had defined her was fading, replaced by resilience that reminded Marcus of her mother. Elena had become something Marcus hadn't quite defined yet. Friend seemed insufficient given what they'd survived together, but anything more felt presumptuous, rushing toward connection he wasn't sure he was capable of sustaining. They had dinner twice a week, alternating between her house and his. Conversations ranging from mundane daily life to deeper discussions about trauma, recovery, what it meant to rebuild after everything had been torn down. She understood him in ways most people couldn't, recognized the signs of hypervigilance and insomnia, gave him space when he needed it and companionship when isolation became dangerous. It was the healthiest relationship Marcus had experienced since before his first deployment, which simultaneously comforted and terrified him. Coldwater Ridge itself had transformed. 8 families who'd been forced out by Caldwell's intimidation had returned, buying back their properties with restitution payments from the liquidation of Caldwell Energy Solutions. The company's assets, including the land it had acquired through fraud and coercion, were being sold to pay victims and cover federal fines. The lithium deposits remained untapped, would likely stay that way for decades given the legal complications and environmental concerns. The town had elected a new sheriff, a former state trooper named Maria Gonzalez, who'd built her campaign on transparency and accountability. She'd reached out to Marcus within her first week, asked if he'd consider consulting on security matters, helping develop emergency response protocols. He'd agreed, finding purpose in preparation, in ensuring the community could protect itself if another predator emerged. Rachel Koenig had published a book about the Coldwater Ridge incident, a detailed investigation of corporate corruption and individual resistance that spent 6 weeks on bestseller lists. She donated a portion of proceeds to the families affected by Caldwell's conspiracy, used her platform to highlight similar situations in other isolated communities across the country. She'd asked Marcus to speak at events, tell his story, inspire others. He declined every time, uncomfortable with celebrity, with being held up as exemplar when he'd simply done what training and conscience demanded. But he'd read the book, recognized the accuracy of her reporting, appreciated that she'd centered Elena's resistance rather than his intervention. The trial had begun in January. Federal prosecutors methodically presenting evidence of conspiracy, racketeering, assault, attempted murder. Richard Caldwell sat in court each day, his expensive suits and polished appearance unable to conceal the reality of his situation. He was facing 40 years in federal prison, his wealth frozen, his empire dismantled, his name synonymous with corruption. Travis Kern had taken a plea deal, agreed to testify against Caldwell in exchange for reduced sentence. Sheriff Hutchins had done the same, his 20-year law enforcement career ending in disgrace in a federal penitentiary. The mercenaries who'd attacked the cabin had received sentences ranging from 8 to 15 years, their private military contractor employer facing corporate dissolution and criminal charges of its own. Justice was slow but thorough, and Marcus found satisfaction in watching the system function as designed when corruption was exposed and couldn't be hidden. He testified during the trial's third week, spending 2 days on the witness stand describing the attack, the fire, the defense of Elena and Sophia. Defense attorneys had tried to paint him as vigilante, as unstable veteran with PTSD who'd overreacted to situation that didn't require lethal force. The prosecution had systematically demolished that narrative, with evidence, with testimony from Elena and Sophia, with the FBI's own investigation confirming every element of Marcus's account. The jury had watched him with expressions ranging from sympathy to admiration, and Marcus had hated every second of it, the attention, the exposure, the way his trauma was dissected for legal strategy. But he'd endured it because justice required his testimony, because Elena deserved to see her tormentors held accountable, because some things were worth discomfort. On a February morning, with snow falling soft and steady outside his window, Marcus received an email that changed his trajectory once again. It was from a woman named Catherine Reed, director of a nonprofit organization called Sentinel Watch, which connected military veterans with isolated communities facing exploitation or corruption. She'd read about Coldwater Ridge, had been following similar cases across rural America, believed there was systemic need for exactly the kind of intervention Marcus had provided. Her organization wanted to fund a pilot program, hire veterans to serve as community advocates, and security consultants in places where traditional law enforcement was compromised or insufficient. She wanted to know if Marcus would be interested in leading the program, using Coldwater Ridge as the model for how it could function. Marcus read the email 3 times, then forwarded it to Elena without comment. She called 30 minutes later, her voice carrying excitement he didn't entirely share. "This is perfect for you. This is exactly what you talked about, finding purpose, using your skills to help people. You have to do this." "I don't know if I'm the right person." Marcus stared at the email on his screen. "Leading a program means structure, administration, dealing with bureaucracy. That's not who I am. I'm an operator, not a manager." "Then be an operator who happens to manage others." Elena's tone shifted, becoming more serious. "Marcus, you've spent 3 months here helping rebuild one community. Imagine doing that for dozens of communities, maybe hundreds. Training other veterans to do what you did, creating a network of people willing to stand against corruption. That's not just purpose, that's legacy." The word resonated in ways Marcus hadn't anticipated. Legacy. What would he leave behind when his time was done? In the military, it was missions completed, enemies eliminated, objectives achieved, all classified and forgotten within years. But this, creating a system that protected vulnerable communities, that gave veterans new mission and civilians new hope, that could endure beyond any individual action, that was legacy worth building. He drafted a response to Catherine Reed, agreeing to meet to discuss the program's structure and his potential role. He didn't commit, not yet, but he opened the door to possibility. Elena read his draft, suggested small changes, sent it with her approval. The response came within hours. Catherine could be in Montana the following week, wanted to see Coldwater Ridge firsthand, meet with Elena and community members, understand what had worked and what could be replicated. Marcus agreed to host her, arranged meetings, found himself planning and coordinating in ways that felt foreign but not entirely uncomfortable. Sophia's 10th birthday fell on the same week as Catherine's visit. Elena threw a party, the first real celebration the girl had experienced since her father's death. Marcus attended with Axe, uncomfortable at social gatherings but unable to decline Elena's invitation. Sophia spent the party showing off Axe to her friends. Children who'd heard stories about the hero dog and wanted to touch his fur, see his prosthetic leg, hear him bark on command. Axe tolerated the attention with patience Marcus found remarkable, the war dog revealing gentleness Marcus hadn't known existed beneath the training and trauma. Sophia opened presents, surrounded by friends and family, her laughter genuine and frequent. The frightened child who'd clutched her inhaler in a burning forest, now simply a girl celebrating her birthday. She saved Marcus's gift for last, a leather-bound journal and an expensive pen, tools for recording her own story. Sophia looked at him with eyes too knowing for 10 years old and said simply, "Thank you for saving us, for showing Mom that fighting back was possible." The words hit Marcus harder than he'd expected, emotion rising in his throat that he forced down through years of practiced control. He managed a nod, couldn't trust his voice, accepted Sophia's hug with awkward gratitude. Elena found him later on the porch, Axe at his feet, both watching the sun set behind the mountains that had nearly been their graves. She stood beside him in comfortable silence before speaking. "Catherine arrives tomorrow. Are you ready?" The question contained layers beyond the surface meaning. Ready to take on new mission? Ready to expand beyond Coldwater Ridge? Ready to commit to something permanent? "I think so." Marcus wasn't entirely certain, but uncertainty had stopped being reason to refuse action. The unknown was where you found growth, where you discovered capabilities you didn't know you possessed. "I've spent 3 months learning to be civilian, learning that peace doesn't mean absence of purpose. Maybe it's time to carry that lesson somewhere it's needed." "What about Coldwater Ridge? What about us?" Elena's voice was quiet, vulnerable in ways she rarely allowed. "I know you need to do this, need to help other communities, but I don't want you to disappear, to become stranger who saved us once and never came back." Marcus turned to face her, saw fear and hope warring in her expression. "I'm not disappearing. Coldwater Ridge is home now, or the closest thing I've had to home in 15 years. Whatever comes next, I come back here, to you. To Sophia. To this." He gestured at the town below, the mountains beyond, the space they'd carved out of trauma and violence. "If that's something you want." Elena's answer was stepping closer, closing distance both literal and metaphorical, her hand finding his. "It's something I want. Something Sophia wants. We've built family from broken pieces, and you're part of that whether you realize it or not." The kiss was gentle, tentative, weighted with months of unspoken possibility, finally becoming real. Marcus felt barriers he'd maintained since Kabul beginning to crack, allowing connection he'd thought himself incapable of sustaining. It terrified him and felt right simultaneously, the contradiction of being human, of allowing yourself vulnerability when every instinct screamed for self-protection. Catherine Reed arrived the next morning with a proposal that was ambitious and practical. Sentinel Watch would fund pilot program in 6 communities across rural America, each paired with veteran consultant trained in security, investigation, and community organization. Marcus would lead the program, train the consultants, provide operational oversight. He'd spend 2 weeks per month traveling, 2 weeks in Coldwater Ridge maintaining his own community ties. Salary was reasonable, benefits comprehensive. Mission aligned perfectly with skills and purpose he'd discovered over past 3 months. Marcus accepted on one condition. Axe remained with him, recognized as working dog, integral to the mission rather than pet or accessory. Catherine agreed immediately, had already planned to incorporate working dogs into the program, recognizing their tactical value and emotional impact. She spent 3 days in Coldwater Ridge, interviewing residents, documenting processes, building framework for replication. Elena participated fully, her perspective as victim-turned-advocate crucial for understanding what communities needed most. On Catherine's final evening, A town-held gathering at the community center, a celebration and acknowledgement of what they'd survived and built. Frank gave speech about resilience, about refusing to surrender to fear. Sheriff Gonzalez talked about rebuilding trust between law enforcement and community. Rachel Koenig announced that portion of her book proceeds would fund scholarships for Coldwater Ridge students, ensuring next generation had opportunities their parents nearly lost. And Elena spoke last, her voice steady, about the importance of standing together, of refusing to be isolated and conquered, of believing that help existed even when it seemed impossibly distant. Marcus stood at the back of the room, uncomfortable with attention, uncomfortable with being celebrated. But he stayed because community mattered, because these people had welcomed him, because Sophia was watching with pride, and Elena kept glancing back to ensure he hadn't disappeared. Axe sat beside him, the dog's presence grounding. Reminder that purpose came in many forms, but always required courage. The gathering ended with request from Catherine that Marcus say something, share lesson from his experience. He resisted, then saw Elena's encouraging nod and forced himself forward. He kept it brief, uncomfortable with public speaking, with exposing the thoughts he usually kept contained. I came to Montana looking for isolation, for escape from memories I couldn't reconcile. What I found was that escape isn't the answer. Purpose is. Standing for something larger than yourself is. He looked at Elena, at Sophia, at faces of people who'd found courage to resist after watching him resist. Sometimes all it takes is one person willing to stand, but that first person needs to believe others will stand with them. That's what makes community powerful. Not individual strength, but collective refusal to accept injustice. The applause was genuine, but Marcus barely registered it, already moving back to his position at the room's edge, to acts and shadows and comfort of observation rather than participation. But Elena caught him before he escaped, squeezed his hand, whispered that he'd done well. Sophia hugged his leg, declared him best speaker of the night, despite objective evidence otherwise. And Marcus, uncomfortable and grateful and something approaching happy, accepted their affection as the gift it was. 3 months later, Sentinel Watch program launched officially, 5 additional veterans hired and trained, 6 communities identified for pilot intervention. Marcus spent his traveling weeks in places that reminded him of Coldwater Ridge, isolated towns where corruption flourished in darkness, where his presence and axes and the promise of federal support shifted balance of power. He taught veterans how to assess threats, document evidence, coordinate with non-compromised authorities, protect civilians while avoiding escalation. Some situations resolved peacefully through exposure and legal pressure. Others required show of force, demonstration that predators could be opposed. None matched Coldwater Ridge's intensity, but all mattered to people living them. His weeks home became sacred, time with Elena and Sophia, with community he'd saved and that had saved him in turn. They built something that looked like family, unconventional and scarred, but real. Sophia started calling him Marcus instead of Mr. Thornton, sometimes slipping and saying something that sounded like Dad before correcting herself. Elena became partner in every sense, relationship deepening beyond crisis bond into genuine love built on shared values and mutual respect. Axe remained constant, the dog's loyalty absolute, his presence reminder that some bonds transcended words or species. One evening in late spring, sitting on Elena's porch watching Sophia play with Axe in the yard, Elena asked the question Marcus had been expecting. Is this enough? The traveling, the coming back, the splitting yourself between mission and home? Or will you eventually need to choose? Marcus considered carefully, wanting to answer honestly. 6 months ago, I would have said I needed to choose, that trying to maintain both would fail. But I've learned that purpose and connection aren't contradictory. They feed each other. The work makes me better partner, better presence here. And having home to return to makes the work sustainable instead of consuming. So this is permanent? Us, Sophia, Coldwater Ridge? Elena's voice held hope and fear equally balanced. If you'll have me. Damaged veteran with PTSD, bad at talking about feelings, brings home trauma from fieldwork, not exactly dream partner. Marcus allowed himself a small smile. But I'm here, I'm trying, and I'm not leaving unless you ask me to. Elena's kiss answered more eloquently than words, and Sophia's delighted shout from the yard suggested she'd been listening, hoping for exactly this outcome. Axe barked once, whether approval or demand for attention unclear, and Marcus felt something he'd thought lost forever in Kabul. in the moments after his squad had been killed and he'd survived. Hope, not for perfect healing or complete peace, but for life worth living, for purpose worth serving, for connections worth maintaining despite risk and vulnerability. The mountains rose beyond Coldwater Ridge, beautiful and indifferent, witness to violence and recovery, destruction and rebuilding. Somewhere in those mountains, Marcus had found something he hadn't known he was searching for. Not escape from his past, but integration of it. Not isolation from connection, but embrace of community. Not absence of mission, but evolution of it. He was Marcus Thornton, veteran, protector, partner. And something approaching father to girl who needed one, and man who needed to be one. He had purpose in work that mattered and home that welcomed him. He had acts, loyal beyond measure, and people worth protecting. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't unmarked by trauma or free from struggle, but it was real. And that Marcus had discovered was enough. If this story touched your heart, if you believe that standing against injustice matters, that one person can make difference, that courage inspires courage, please share it. Tell us in the comments what you would have done in Marcus's position. Whether you believe communities can protect themselves, what you think happens next for Coldwater Ridge and Sentinel Watch. Subscribe to the channel for more stories about ordinary people finding extraordinary courage, about veterans discovering new missions, about communities refusing to surrender to corruption. And remember, somewhere out there, someone is waiting for Hero to stand with them. When that call comes, when injustice demands response, will you answer? Because sometimes all it takes is one person willing to stand. And when they do, others will stand beside them. That's how communities survive. That's how justice prevails. That's how broken people and broken places become whole again. One courageous action at a time. May you find your own courage when it's needed. May you stand for those who cannot. And may you never forget that being a warrior isn't about violence. It's about protecting those who need protection. Until the next story, stay strong, stay vigilant, and remember that peace is built by those willing to fight for it.